It is the early hours of September 27th, 1944, and the village of Overloon in the southern Netherlands sits under a cold, rain-soaked darkness. The fields surrounding it are thick with mud, the kind that swallows boots whole and makes every step feel like a small act of defiance against the earth itself. Somewhere out in that blackness, dug into a network of trenches and farmhouse cellars, are the soldiers of the 107th Panzer Brigade, veterans, hardened men who had survived the Eastern Front, Normandy, and the brutal retreat across France. They are not easily frightened. They have heard artillery. They have heard the groan of Sherman tanks rolling over the horizon. They know the sounds of war as intimately as a conductor knows his orchestra. But tonight, something is different. From somewhere to the north, no one can quite pinpoint where, there comes a sound that makes no sense. It is a bugle call, a single, clear, almost comically cheerful bugle call cutting through the autumn rain. And then, before any German commander can react, the ground itself seems to shudder. A rolling thunder fills the air, not from the sky, but from the earth. The sounds of heavy armor, dozens, perhaps hundreds of tanks, flood the darkness from every direction at once. Engines rev, track links clatter. Officers bark orders in what sounds unmistakably like English. It is, by every available indication, an enormous armoured assault, bearing down on the German position from multiple angles simultaneously. The 107th Panzer Brigade begins to withdraw, and not a single British tank had moved. What those German soldiers heard that night was not an army. It was a gramophone, a carefully engineered, deliberately absurd, and extraordinarily effective piece of British psychological warfare technology that military historians have spent decades either laughing about or quietly marveling at, sometimes both at once. It was called the sonic deception system, though most of the men who used it simply called it the noise machine. And the story of how it came to exist and what it achieved is one of the most peculiar and underappreciated chapters of the entire Second World War. To understand why the British Army went to the considerable trouble of building a mobile, truck-mounted sound effects machine capable of convincing trained soldiers that they were being overrun by armor, you need to understand the particular problem that plagued Allied commanders throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe in 1944. The problem, in its simplest terms, was this. The Germans were very good at knowing where you were. German reconnaissance units, combined with aerial observation and an extensive network of local informants, meant that large concentrations of Allied armor were extraordinarily difficult to conceal. The moment a division of tanks assembled for an assault, the Germans knew about it, and they repositioned accordingly. Fights were almost impossible because any feint required actual tanks, and actual tanks were visible. By the time a deception maneuver was complete, it had usually been identified for exactly what it was. This had direct, measurable consequences. At the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, for instance, German commanders had repositioned multiple panzer units within 48 hours of Allied armoured concentration, not because of superior intelligence alone, but because they trusted their acoustic and visual monitoring. A German panzer commander in the field had a remarkable sixth sense about when armour was massing nearby. Because massing armour is enormously loud and sound travels, what the Allied planners needed was a way to create the impression of a large armoured force without actually moving one. What they needed, in other words, was a very convincing lie that could be told in the dark. The answer came from a rather unlikely direction. In 1942, a small and officially unnamed research unit operating under the umbrella of the Inter-Services Topographical Department, a body with a name dull enough to put even the most dedicated spy to sleep, began experimenting with high-quality audio recordings and industrial-grade speaker systems. The individuals involved were not, for the most part, soldiers in any conventional sense. Several had backgrounds in theatre and radio broadcasting. One had previously worked for the BBC engineering department. Another had spent the pre-war years designing public address systems for large outdoor events. What they produced, over the course of roughly 18 months, was a system of quite impressive technical sophistication, dressed up in the most makeshift-looking packaging imaginable. The core of the sonic deception system was a set of gramophone recordings, acetate discs, each one approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, on which had been recorded the sounds of specific military activities. There were recordings of tank engines starting up, of tank columns moving at various speeds, of infantry assembling, of artillery being repositioned, of supply lorries in convoy. Each sound had been recorded in the field using real equipment, and considerable care had been taken to capture not just the main sound source, but the ambient acoustic environment around it. The way sound bounces off buildings, rolls across open fields, or is absorbed by woodland. These recordings were then played back through a system of loudspeakers mounted in the rear of a standard 3-ton Bedford lorry. The speakers themselves were directional units, capable of projecting sound with remarkable focus and at volume levels sufficient to be heard at a distance of roughly 1.5 kilometers under normal conditions. The entire system, recording equipment, amplifiers, speakers, and generator, weighed approximately 4.5 tons in total and could be operational within 20 minutes of the lorry stopping. The trick, and it was a considerable trick, lay not in the volume of sound produced, but in the layering of it. The operators, small teams of 2 or 3 men, could blend multiple recordings simultaneously, creating a composite acoustic picture of military activity that was extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from the real thing. A tank column approaching, for instance, would not simply sound like a single recording of tank engines. It would sound like tank engines at varying distances, with the acoustic compression of the sound changing as the notional vehicles moved closer, interspersed with the metallic clatter of track links, the occasional squeal of a turret traversing, and the muffled bark of a commander's voice. The bugle, incidentally, was a deliberate artistic choice. British armoured units occasionally used bugle calls as a coordination signal, and its sudden appearance in the audio mix served a specific purpose. It told any German officer listening that what he was hearing was organised, deliberate, and imminent. It was the sound of intent. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It really does keep this kind of history alive and reaching people who deserve to hear it. Overloon was not the only occasion on which the sonic deception system was deployed with notable effect. Records, many of which remain partially restricted, suggest the system was used on at least 11 separate occasions during the campaign in northwest Europe between September and December 1944. The details of several operations remain frustratingly vague, a consequence of the classification applied to psychological warfare activities in the immediate post-war period, and the subsequent loss of some operational logs during the hasty demobilization of 1945 and 1946. What can be documented with reasonable confidence is the system's use in support of several river crossing operations, where the intention was to draw German defensive attention away from the actual crossing point by suggesting that armour was massing some distance to the left or right. In at least 2 instances, German units repositioned in response to acoustic deception before the real crossing had even begun, surrendering ground that would otherwise have required a direct assault to take. One German officer, captured near Venlo in November 1944, described hearing what he was certain was a British armoured brigade assembling in woodland to his north. His unit had repositioned southward before discovering that the woodland contained nothing but a British lorry and 3 very cold signalmen. The Germans, it should be acknowledged, were not entirely naive to the concept of acoustic deception. The Wehrmacht had experimented with sound projection equipment as early as 1940, primarily for use in training exercises to simulate battlefield noise for infantry recruits. By 1943, there is evidence of limited German interest in operational acoustic deception, though the results appear to have been considerably less sophisticated than the British equivalent. German efforts tended towards higher volume rather than greater fidelity, a choice that paradoxically made their recordings easier to identify as recordings. Real tank engines have an acoustic texture that is remarkably difficult to replicate at very high amplification without introducing distortion that trained ears can detect. The Americans, meanwhile, had developed their own parallel program that would become considerably better known in the post-war decades. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, popularly nicknamed the Ghost Army, used a combination of inflatable dummy tanks, false radio traffic, and sonic deception equipment to conduct over 20 major deception operations across the European theatre. Their sonic equipment was larger and louder than the British system, capable of projecting sound at volumes audible up to 24 kilometers away under the right atmospheric conditions. What the American system gained in raw volume, however, it sometimes sacrificed in acoustic detail. The British approach, characteristically perhaps, prioritized plausibility over spectacle. Whether the British system directly influenced the American program, or whether the two developed largely in parallel, remains a matter of some historical debate. There is correspondence in the archive suggesting that British and American psychological warfare officers compared notes during the summer of 1944, but the degree to which either program borrowed from the other is difficult to establish with certainty. What is clear is that the underlying concept, that sound alone, in the right conditions, could influence the decisions of trained military commanders, was validated independently by both programs. That is, in its way, the most remarkable conclusion of all. The legacy of the sonic deception system is an odd thing to assess, because its successes were, almost by definition, invisible. A successful deception operation leaves no trace of itself in the historical record except as an absence. A German unit that moved when it shouldn't have, a crossing that succeeded without the casualties that might otherwise have been expected. The very nature of the work made it difficult to quantify and easy to overlook. In the immediate post-war period, psychological warfare activities were systematically downplayed by most military establishments, partly out of institutional embarrassment. There was something that felt undignified about winning through trickery, and partly because the classification of deception operations was maintained for far longer than the classification of more conventional military activities. The result is that the sonic deception system and the men who operated it largely disappeared from the popular historical record, while the battles they helped to shape remained well documented. A small number of surviving examples of the recording equipment used in the program are held in storage at the Imperial War Museum in London, though they are not routinely on public display. The Bedford lorries themselves were long since demobilized and scrapped, as was the case with most specialized military vehicles in the chaotic months following the end of hostilities in Europe. The men who operated the system received no special commendations for their work. Several gave interviews in the 1970s and 1980s that touched on their wartime service, though even then, Many were circumspect about the details. One former operator interviewed for a BBC radio programme in 1981 described the work with characteristic British understatement as rather unusual, but not without its satisfactions. Return for a moment to that rain-soaked field near Overloon, to the German soldiers crouching in their positions, listening to something that their every instinct told them was real. The groan of engines, the clatter of tracks, the bright, absurd note of a bugle cutting through the dark. They made a rational decision based on the information available to them. They fell back. They ceded ground they had been ordered to hold. And somewhere behind them, in the darkness, 3 British signalmen sat in a lorry, watching their needles and adjusting their levels, doing their very best not to make a sound. The remarkable thing is not that the deception worked. Deceptions had worked before, and they would work again. The remarkable thing is what it tells us about the nature of warfare itself. That battles are not decided solely by the weapons that are fired, but by the decisions that are made in the moments before anyone fires at all. Fear, uncertainty, the grinding human need to interpret the darkness around you. These are as much the terrain of war as any muddy field in the Netherlands. The British sonic deception system exploited all of that with a gramophone, a lorry, and one rather silly bugle call. And it worked.